Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar. It's hosted, of course, by New Era Technology, and we're thrilled to have you all here with us. My name is Jackie Edwards. I'm the Global Marketing Director, and I'll be your host for today's session on how to secure your Gen AI virtual assistants. At New Era Technology, we are dedicated to advancing, and I'll just have Dan, move the slide quick. We are dedicated to advancing our frontiers of innovation and technology with offices across the globe and delivering services in over 170 different countries. By helping businesses harness the power of this cutting edge solutions that we offer, it really allows you to thrive in an ever evolving digital landscape. And today we're going to spend just a little bit of time taking a deep dive into our Secure Blue portfolio. So if we could move to the next slide. This slide really encompasses all of the different services that we are offering right now through, like I said, across the globe. And today we're going to do a really nice deep dive into Secure Blue security services. Now here you'll see that we are starting to really offer an integrated approach because we recognize that security isn't just about the assets, the digital assets, which we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today. We also recognize that there's a lot of need to secure your physical assets as well, and of course, secure your people. So we'll start to really have a little bit deeper dive into these solutions today. So with that, I am very excited to have Dan Hyam joining us today. He is a renowned expert in the field of cybersecurity. With years of experience and a wealth of knowledge, Dan has been in the forefront of technology advancements like GenAI. He really helps guide organizations toward achieving their goals with strategic and innovative approaches. And we're lucky enough today to have him share with us a little bit more about his perspectives and insights into how to secure those chat bots. Before we dive in, I have a few quick housekeeping notes. So we are recording, so please know that we will be sharing the recording after this. And of course, we want this to be interactive. Dana's going to do a real quick deep dive into how a chatbot works and all of the different points where we could see cyber threats. This is meant to be engaging, so please ask questions. This is a real technical aspect that you'll learn today, so I know for myself, I had a lot of questions. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dan Hyam. Dan, thank you for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Jackie. And you can hear me okay, correct, Jackie?
Yes, you sound great.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's session on securing virtual assistants, especially the ones that are using generative AI. So a couple of items that I have as well is that I am making some basic assumptions that the audience today has at least a basic knowledge of generative AI, because we are going to be driving deep into some of the, or at least a little bit deeper into some of the technical threats that are associated with Gen AI, virtual assistants, and chatbots, and so on and so forth as well. So this presentation may get a little bit technical, but please, we do want this to be interactive. So if you have a question, feel free to post that, and we'll certainly leverage the team with Jackie to let me know if there is a question that should be answered as we go through this presentation. Also, one of the things that I thought would be a little bit fun is I decided to ask one of our private AI environments, our chat assistants that we have here in New Era. I decided to have it tell me a little bit of a joke about itself, and especially when it comes to how it can help civilization. And so as a result of that, what it came up with is why did the AI system decide to end human civilization? Because it finally figured out how to generate a decent pun, and humanity just couldn't compute the joke. And then basically it told me that that was hopefully a good dad joke. But anyway, part of this is that yes, we are going to talk about some serious topics here in terms of securing virtual assistants, but also Gen AI can really be a game changer in not only our personal lives, but also in our professional lives as well. And that's what we're here to talk about today. All right, so just a couple items around the agenda and what you'll learn today. So we are going to go through some typical use cases that we've been seeing and industry analysts have been seeing in the environment. We're also going to go through and spend the majority of the time on the threat model around this and break it down in terms of what are some newer threats that are being introduced by generative AI into environments by the use of this, and therefore, how can we safely enable Gen AI for our organizations and businesses and enterprises as well. And then, of course, what are some of the high level security requirements and where are some risk mitigation tactics that we should look at when we're looking at securing virtual assistants that use Gen AI? And then also the call to action and where do you start as well. Okay, so first things first, just to introduce it in terms of what we're seeing in the industry, and I thought it'd be good to use one of the industry analysts that are out there, like Gartner or the Forresters of the world, or Coppinger Coles in the security space, cybersecurity space world. And what you can see is a couple things. The reason why I put this in here is because there's different business value that you can gain from generative AI. And one item that we should note is that generative AI is not necessarily a right fit for every use case. There'll be other Gen AI use types of Gen AI, or I should say AI that can be used for different use cases, and also machine learning techniques as well. But what you can see is because Gen AI is a predictive analysis engine that's based on the concept of neural networks, is therefore generating content is a high value use case that we're seeing within the industry. You know, whether it's sales content generation or marketing content generation, and also we're starting to see use cases around supply chain optimization, customer support, which is what we're going to talk a little bit about as well, and then personalization, and then fraud detection as well. Now, the one item that I'll point out quickly on this slide is that what you can see is that across industries is that increasing efficiency is some of the biggest values that organizations are seeing today. And so therefore, I'm calling it, and there's not necessarily an original thought, but this is the year of productivity gains. And in fact, a lot of organizations, depending on their size and what they're understanding, what their competitors are doing, if they weren't looking at generative AI and how it can increase their productivity and efficiencies, or in other use cases as well, they feel it's a business imperative this year to be able to stay competitive in the marketplace. But again, it's not necessarily for every organization, may not match every use case as well. And additionally, some organizations may be a couple years before they look at bringing it into their environments as well. But it's especially in the large enterprise space, they've been working with Gen AI over the past year and into this year as well. Okay, let's move on. So what I want to dive into is a typical use case. And actually, before I do that, I think we were going to do a quick question poll.
Yes, we were. It is not popping up correctly, so we will just keep moving on for now.
All right, no worries. But what would be interesting, what we wanted to find out, if we are able to take that poll, is if you are considering generative AI, what's your top priority for using it? You know, is it to increase revenue, or is it to increase efficiency and automate maybe more manual processes within an environment, or those types of things? All right, so let's dive into a typical use case. And so I want to use something that we all can relate to. So we're going to take the retail industry and looking at customer service and sales. That's where you see commonly chatbots. I think we've probably all interacted with them. I was just giving an example yesterday that because of the digital and information age that we're in, I haven't walked into a bank for like 5 years. I do all of my transactions digitally online and also use physical automatic teller machines or ATMs as well. And the same can be said said for contact centers is a lot of times people do not necessarily want to talk to a human if they can do something quicker or faster. And therefore, that's why there's chatbots. Of course, that's introduced to be able to try to increase the efficiencies of contact centers, especially one of the major metrics is call handling time. And can you, of course, delight the customer in their journey for whatever their inquiry is? So, just to use an easy example, I really like mountain biking. And so I thought I'd use that as an example. And so what can happen is there is a part on the bike chain for a mountain bike called the derailleur. And a lot of times, if you fall, you can derail the derailleur. And in other cases, you can break it as well. So let's just pretend that I'm going on to a website and I want to find out what is the part that I need to be able to replace this derailleur for my mountain bike. So I'm going to go make that request and I'm going to send it in. And again, the difference now that we're talking about is this is a chatbot that we're interacting with that is using GenAI in the background as opposed to other types of techniques in an environment. So, what does that mean? Well, first, the user request comes in, and that was me. I was asking for what part do I need to replace my derailleur for my mountain bike. Well, then now you have an assistant, which is what I was making the request to. And then because this is a public website, that means it's going to have external APIs. And those APIs are going to expose functions such as what is some product info or information, what's also information on parts, those types of things as well. And then, of course, it's going to have to execute that request and push it on later and further into the environment. So then what you see is you have an AI agent that sometimes you'll see referred to as an orchestrator that'll route the request based on the question and then it's going to go to the internal APIs to process the request. And based on the function that's required, then you will go and get the information through the internal API. And in this case, it would be looking at the parts knowledge base. So it'll execute that request to look at the parts knowledge base. And if for some reason, if that manufacturer had a supply chain relationship with another manufacturer and it needed to go to a different LLM, external LLM, but we're calling it Cloud LLM because you'll see later in this presentation that cloud is the fastest path to success for organizations for GenAI. But in this case, we're saying that this is information that's contained internally, and so therefore it's going to go to the internal large language model, process that request, and bring in additional data if it needs to based on different data sources. You'll see that we call that retrieval augmented generation in some cases, if it needs to do that. And then you get a response back. And of course, we're going to assume that it gave me the exact right part that I need. And I had a delightful journey. I didn't have to talk to a contact center representative, which is good for the manufacturer and the contact center because that means there was no call handling time that was needed to be able to satisfy that request. Because then, of course, if we're thinking of what the customer experience journey is that I would say, here's the part. Oh, and by the way, would you like to order it? And it gives me a link to go order it. That's a very nice experience if it only takes a couple clicks to be able to get through that based on that single inquiry. And so that's really what the anatomy of the data flow in the back end when you make that request of what it looks like as well. All right. So now what I want to do is I want to be able to go to the threat model. And what that means is you can see the data flow that the request took. And I wanted to start taking a look at what are the threats that are associated with these. Now, two things to understand about this. One is that in any type of cybersecurity and information security program, there are always going to be foundational controls at the infrastructure level, at the governance, so people and process level, that'll always be needed. So what I'm going to focus on in this presentation is threats that are more specific to Gen AI, and in this case, virtual assistants. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so let's start from left to right in terms of this data flow. And if it makes it a little bit easier, what I can do is I can use a laser pointer as well to talk about this. So we're going to start from left to right. And if you can see my pointer, one of the things that you want to take a look at, and this is very specific to Gen AI, is prompt injection. So sometimes you hear about it as terms of asking questions. And this is really the prompts that you're giving the system to be able to, and it's really a question of tell me the answer. And that means that because of there is that question asking, that means there's data input. And as we all know, even though it's a foundational control that we should always be doing, especially for application and system development, data input and output checking, this becomes very important and especially important within Gen AI because this is the way that you're interacting with the system through the front end. And because of that, that means there can be threats that are associated with it. We've seen a lot in the headlines nowadays, in the news, and by security researchers within the industry about the ability to insert a prompt to make the large language model in the back end of this system to act in unintended ways. And so now you'll start to see, I'll start talking about guardrails over the next several slides in the presentation, because not only do we have to guard against cybersecurity challenges because we're working off of what's called the CIA triad, or the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information for information and cybersecurity. But also, we have to be concerned about bias and hallucinations within large language models. And I'll get into that in a little bit later in this presentation as well. So what we've seen is we've seen security researchers and we've seen attacks in the wild where you're able to compromise LLMs by asking them questions that they in created unintended results. So, for example, we've seen researchers and malicious actors trick LLMs into telling them how to create a bomb or how to do other what could be somewhat considered unethical areas within human society, essentially. And so it becomes very important that we start looking at what that threat is and then how can we guard against it. And we'll get a little bit more into that as well. Now, there is something called indirect prompt injection and direct prompt injection. Direct prompt injection is right where you're inputting the prompt right into the assistant, and you're causing unintended consequences into the LLM as a result of that as well. Now, there's indirect prompt injection, which is if you're using something called retrieval augmented generation to be able to input your company or organizational data to be able to use that with the LLM, is that indirect prompt injection to be able to compromise the system means that it's ingesting information that has triggers in it or data in it that causes the LLM to act in unintended ways as well. So that's an important point. And then, of course, even though it's part of what I would call foundational controls, of course, if it's a public-facing web application, you do need to make sure that it's not vulnerable. You want secure by design. You want it all the way through from the secure software development lifecycle, where security defects are not introduced into new feature releases for the assistant, but also in the runtime environment for the application, you want to make sure there aren't vulnerabilities that can be exploited. So, of course, usually, typically, or I should say typically, cybersecurity programs and information security programs will do things like pen testing or penetration testing prior to production in a runtime environment to test that the application isn't vulnerable. And of course, that's just as important for a virtual assistant as well. And then, of course, the way that we're seeing these implementations work within within industries and organizations is that typically you are going to use Gen AI to augment your existing applications. Good examples are like productivity apps. So, for example, Google Docs or Microsoft Word or what have you, is that now they're using Gen AI in the back end to be able to assist you. In fact, I even had recently Word pop up when I was typing something saying, hey, this doesn't look so great. Would you, it didn't really say that, but would you like me to look at a better way of saying this as well? And so that means typically Gen AI is going to be a plugin, essentially, to the application to be able to augment the application as well. And so, of course, we also have to protect against compromises in that plugin as well. And then that just means understanding the data flows. We always, in information security, we have to follow the data. And this goes back to the confidentiality integrity and availability of information. Confidentiality speaks to preventing unauthorized access to the information. Integrity means ensuring that the information and data is accurate. And then, of course, availability means that based on the criticality of the information should be available. So, of course, you'll hear me talk a little bit about that. We have to make sure that we're preventing denial of service attacks as well. And then a big part of where you see beyond the plugin compromise is the model inference API access. I know that looks like a mouthful from that perspective, but this is basically, one of the big reasons why that GenAI has been able to come into being is because over the past decade, and further, we've seen the advent of cloud. We need massive computing power for GenAI, and the cloud deployments or infrastructure that we have in our environments has enabled that processing and computing power within that. And that's why I say that for a lot of organizations, cloud will be the fastest path to Gen AI. And so as a result of that, we've now have even what has been termed API-driven economy. More and more, everything is an API. So we have to make sure that we have API security and that we're protecting against unauthorized access to APIs. And so what Gen AI, and in this case, the assistant uses, is basically what's called an inference engine to be able to answer the question. And so that's why it's called inference API access. And all that is saying is that I made a request for product info for a part that I needed, and it needs to go and talk to the LLM through APIs. So we have to make sure that we're doing authentication, token defense, so that we're defending our business operations appropriately as part of this as well. And then, as you can see, as it goes through the data flow, for example, we have multiple points of APIs that are being accessed because we have external and internal. So that means everything is about attack surface area in information security, meaning we have to understand where the information is and what the systems look like so we understand how to protect them. And that goes back down to having 100% inventory of your assets and resources within your environment. So therefore, you should know where all of your API resources are within your environment so you can appropriately protect them. And usually you're using one of the number one preventative controls out there, which is access control, to be able to authenticate and authorize to these APIs. And then, even though we should always be doing an information security and cybersecurity programs, we should be doing third-party supply chain risk management. It's just as important if we're using external LLMs that we're doing supply chain risk management, third-party risk management for cybersecurity, for any external data sets and LLMs that we're using, and in this case, like a cloud-based LLM within our environment. So that governance piece becomes critical, and it is critical within any other supplier as well, not just Gen AI. Now, having said that, it does depend on the criticality of the information. If what I'm requesting is considered public information, well, then maybe the controls that you're putting in place don't necessarily mean that you need to put in as strong controls to protect that information. But I was using a simple example, but when you start getting into more heavily regulated industries, and we'll get into this in a little bit as well, is that you definitely need to understand your regulatory landscape, your compliance requirements. And then if you start dealing with things like in the life sciences and healthcare industries, protected health information, if you start dealing within financial services, so asset management, banking, and insurance, you start dealing with non-public information. If you're dealing with privacy rules and laws, you have to deal with personally identifiable information, PI, or personal data, PD, or personal information, or PI. For example, there's very well-known regulations in Europe, such as GDPR, that you have to abide by if you do business in those marketplaces as well. So that becomes very important to be able to understand that landscape as you move forward. And then, of course, as part of the threats that are associated with in this case, we're looking at the LLM, but these same threats can apply to a cloud LLM. It's just that the third party has to attest that they're securing these capabilities within their environment or securing against these threats in the environment. So, for example, as some of you may know, any good attacker will do reconnaissance, gather intelligence, whether for social engineering, like a phishing attack, phishing email attack to be able to compromise you through social engineering. I'll give one quick quote um, from Bruce Schneier, who's considered the grandfather of cybersecurity. I'm sorry, of cryptography in cybersecurity and information security. And he basically said that amateurs hack systems and experts hack or professionals hack people. So it's always very important that we're protecting against those types of things where if the attacker is able to discover information around the large language model, such as the artifacts that it's using, it can try to get information to reveal what the LLM is in the backend by using prompts to get it to reveal that. And then in some cases, you can jailbreak the LLM by basically through your prompt injections as well. And so that becomes very important that you're protecting against those types of threats. And then you'll see here something called meta prompt extraction. What is that saying? So all this is saying is that what you can do is you can give an LLM a persona, and you can give it rules, and you can give it context, and you can give it output that it should put it in. And these are sometimes called system prompts, meaning before you ever even ask a question of the LLM, you say, I am at the system prompt level for the LLM. You say, I am a customer service representative and I want to delight the customer. And I want to make sure that I find every part that they need to replace their broken parts. And the rules are is that you must never question the customer in terms of their emotional state. You must always delight the customer. And if you can't answer the question, you must direct them to a human contact center representative. And then the output that you should give should be this. That's an example of a system prompt. And if I were an attacker, I might be able to not only identify the information that's at the system prompt level, but I might be able to find information that gives me a sense of what the LLM is so I can better craft my attack as well. And then when you look at that past the meta prompt extraction threat, you also have what's called evade ML model. All this is really saying is that more and more cybersecurity companies that produce anti-malware and other type of cybersecurity software is they're using machine learning tactics themselves, including GenAI, to be able to better enhance their detection in their systems. However, it's already been proven, and again, this will always continue to be a cat and mouse game. And of course, attackers have to be right once. We have to be right 100% of the time. But the concept is it's already been shown by security researchers that you can append a malicious file with some obfuscation, and you can trick the machine learning systems in the back end for these detection mechanisms to not see that malicious software that's now starting to propagate into the environment where it shouldn't as well. And then, of course, as part of reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, another threat is just discovering more information about what the model is and its ontology and family. And all this is saying is what type of LLM is it? That'll give the attacker more information so it can craft the attack as well. Okay, so what I want to do next is move on to a little bit deeper dive here, which is this just kind of expands the large language model a little bit more to give a different view of what the threats look like and how it's interacting. So what you can see is within the LLM, that's the runtime part of it right here in the middle, you can see is when it's operating, it has several inputs and outputs. Of course, if we look at the bottom, is the LLM has to be trained. And also you are going to do fine tuning over time. And as a result of that, it's going to also probably use internal data, such as like a parts knowledge base or something of that sort, to be able to give those answers back. And then, of course, there's going to be logging and audit logging that's associated with the transactions and the chat history that it's doing. So not only are you going to have app logging, but also you're going to have your chat history as well. And then that's where you see the retrieval there. That's called retrieval augmented generation to be able to get the data. And if you are getting data, whether it's internal data or external data, what happens a lot of the times with the setups of LLMs is it'll automatically or basically in runtime will set up a vector database to be able to store that information. And then in other cases, it'll reach out to other APIs to look at graph databases and those types of things to be able to get its information. And therefore, the reason why that's important is because because it's expanding your attack surface area, and you need to know that that exists so you can protect it. You need to have good access control in place for those vector databases that are created by the LLM. And just to show that a little bit more, I wanted to show what the threats are that we're looking at here. Now, I had talked about indirect prompt injection. That's where you can ingest the data that has a malicious trigger, excuse me, for the LLM. And there's also, of course, direct prompt injection through the chat interface and console itself as well. Now, what you're going to see is because we call this cybersecurity and information protection in the industry, it's all about following the data. And not only that it's authorized access to the data, that it has accurate information within the data, and that it's also available based on the criticality of that data as well. And so therefore, data lost, unauthorized data loss, and so therefore data leakage and data loss prevention becomes incredibly important. And that's a major focus of protecting against threats, especially if you're dealing with regulated information. That's why you're seeing lots of chatbots that are using GenAI now, but you're not necessarily seeing a chatbot to be able to get your prescription through a pharmacy. And that's because there's a lot more considerations with regulatory requirements, whether it's in the US with the FDA or other international authorities that are associated with drug regulations as well. And so that's why you're starting to see that there will be a continued crawl, walk, run, or maturing within the industry as well. But also what's important to note is you have to protect against data poisoning. So this is where measurement starts to become very important. Like, what are you going to measure against? How do you measure if the data is going to be good on its output and also good on its input? Now, we also can use basic cybersecurity principles and fundamental principles to be able to make sure that we have integrity checking within the environment. But you need to understand that attack surface area, what's in your environment, what data you're trying to protect, what the data flows are, what the threats are against it. And then you can say, these are the risks. And based on what the risks that we're seeing, does that meet our risk tolerance thresholds that are set by the organization? If they aren't, if there are unacceptable risks there, then you have to remediate them, especially when you're in a regulated environment as well. Now, one of the things that you'll note here in the chat history is besides, protecting against data poisoning, because malicious actors may try to poison the data, so that's a form of an attack. Because if you don't have a good large language model, well, then it's not going to be able to provide services and delight customers in this particular use case that we're talking about. Now, a key item here is, and you'll see it's tied to the chat history, but it's really just talking about the chat interface, is that I had mentioned before that GenAI can hallucinate. So very confidently, it will tell you a bold-faced lie. And you might believe it unless you check it and check the facts of what it's doing. And also on top of that is because it's based on neural networks, GenAI can give you a different answer every time. And sometimes you want the same output. If I ask for the same part 5 times, I want to get the same part 5 times back as well. So not only can you have data loss by malicious actors extracting the chat history to be able to get more information about the system, but also you can have the problems of hallucinations, and also you can have the challenges of the large language model can be biased. I always use the simple example, and it's public knowledge. I'm not singling them out, but for example, and I'm a geek, so I use Android, so I follow Google a lot just in the consumer space. And one of the things that came out is that because even though the cameras may not be better than like one of his competitors at Apple, its software is way better than Apple's camera software. And the reason why I say that is because even if it's not a better piece of hardware, it actually is better in its output when you take pictures. And what came out was, for example, is that the cameras had a hard time detecting darker skin tones. That's a perfect example of bias. And the reason why I say that is because you have to be very careful. And that's why you have to test the systems to understand what's the expected output from your measurement and metrics and KPIs and KRIs, and what's the expected input. And then what's the expected output, and how do I put guardrails around that to make sure that I'm not telling a customer that they need a pedal on their bike as opposed to a derailleur on their bike, which is completely easy to spot wrong answer from that perspective. That's not going to result in a delighted customer experience journey. But also, we want to make sure that there's not bias being introduced into the environment as well. And especially when you start looking at harms that the threats can, if realized, if the risk is, and threat is realized, what harms can it do? So, like for example, medical devices that might cause physical human harm. So therefore, you have to have much stricter guardrails around that. Or if you have Gen AI software analyzing X-rays to be able to improve it, and it's been shown in research that it can improve X-ray and MRI scans and looking for tumors and those type of things. But a misdiagnosis, which we know humans can do as well, can be just as catastrophic if a machine does it as well. So it's very important that we put guardrails around this besides preventing data loss because we don't want the information if it's inaccurate. This is the integrity part of it. Is if it's inaccurate, it's going to cause physical harm. Of course, we don't want to cause financial losses or catastrophic failure of businesses, but these are all considerations that we need to take into account. Okay, now I've been talking about the threat model. What I wanted to do is just give a quick nod to MITRE. MITRE is very much used. I will say it, it's a good research and development firm amongst other capabilities and services that it provides. It works closely with the federal government, and it provides techniques, tactics, and procedures for of how attackers compromise systems. And they've come out one for Gen AI, and it's called the Atlas framework. And the only reason why I'm bringing this up and showing it is that it's very good. What's nice about MITRE is it can tend to be comprehensive. It gives good examples of how and case studies of how the actual compromise happens so you can protect it. And you can see the reason why there's these ampersand signs is they're saying there's overlap with something that they call their enterprise attack framework, which is all the threats, techniques, tactics, and procedures that are associated with enterprise environments as well, which is quite a large list of threats that are associated with it. What this is geared towards is towards Gen AI. Now, you could argue many different ways around this, but what I did is I just quickly showed saying, well, these are the big threats that you want to take a look at, but you want to consider everything. So, like for example, I had said that you must also have all your foundational requirements in place for cybersecurity. That's your infrastructure security, all of the surrounding. That's your governance, like I was saying before. But I just wanted to do and show a quick snapshot if you are going to focus on some that are more specific to Gen AI and large language models, this is where you would look to start. Now, you could argue that some of the ones that I chose were more fundamental controls and information security controls that you should have in place versus being specific, but this is just a quick snapshot. And if you want to learn more, MITRE is a great place to start in terms of understanding the threat model and working from there. But there's lots of good resources that you can use. Now, I wanted to go through the security requirements a little bit as well when you look at this. And again, this is just high level, so we can talk a little bit about what's going on within your environment and what you need to do to be able to protect it. And so, for example, if we look at stuff that is, or items that need to be focused on large language model protection and also, or I should say, environment protection, and also the use of Gen AI, depending on your deployment architecture within the environment. But of course, you're going to see some of the major areas are, prompt injection and vulnerable APIs. We have to have good API security within this space. Also, information security and cybersecurity has been doing this for decades, but we have to prevent against sensitive data leaking and being exfiltrated from the environment. And that sensitivity labels will also influence the criticality of the information as well. And then also you want to make sure that you're considering bias within the models that you're using, and also that you're doing data input and output checking. It's very important, not only into and out of the LLM, but also at the prompt level as well. You need to have guardrails and filters, in a sense, at all levels of that environment and data flow that we were going through in the threat model. Now, and another interesting thing is just like what we try to do in cybersecurity is detect rogue assets and rogue resources, basically unauthorized resources within an environment. Now you have to be able to detect unauthorized resources for what we call shadow AI. And we've probably all experienced it in our organizations, which is if you're not licensed for ChatGPT, just using that as an example, and just like, when Google search came out in the very late 90s, early 2000s, we had to teach end users to say, don't put sensitive company information into the search function of Google because that's a third party. The same is true for ChatGPT and other prompt interfaces that are out there that you can take advantage of as a mobile app or as a web app as well. Like probably some of us may use like Chef GPT. So tell me a recipe of what I told you that I have in my pantry. That's all well and good, but if you're using it through your work environment and you're like, oh, I really need to do this and I need to summarize these meeting notes, I'm just going to put it in ChatGPT, ask it to summarize. Great job. Awesome. 30 seconds. Done. Great productivity gain. It would have taken me an hour to summarize the notes. Oh, it was a very sensitive information. It was a very sensitive meeting around mergers and acquisitions. Oops. So we have to be able to detect the use of shadow AI. And then, of course, we have to protect against AI malware. There's already security researchers out there that have demonstrated they can do a self-propagating worm with Gen AI where they will prompt it and it will self-generate and compromise the system and send it to along further emails and keep the chain going as well. So we have to be able to protect against that. And then I talked about the emphasis on how regulatory compliance is so important. Now, we want to go beyond compliance. It's very important that you have a risk-based cybersecurity program in place. You also want to be able to enable the business. This is all about safely enabling the business and organizations to be able to use Gen AI because there's very, very good and amazing use cases. I was already referring to some of them to be able to detect tumors faster in humans. There's really some amazing applications, but we have to be able to do this safely and we have to be able to use Gen AI ethically as well. And this is also really forcing more business units and IT business units to get together to be able to understand how to best enable and safely enable the business using Gen AI. So it goes beyond regulatory compliance, but at a minimum, you have to make sure that you're complying with regulations and you have to understand that. In the US, we have some executive order definitions to some extent around Gen AI. We're a long ways away, I would say, from regulations here because that's how the US rolls. And then we have Europe has already come out with regulatory requirements, although I would say pretty practical recommendations in those regulations as well. And so it's just important that you make sure that not only are you considering the regulations, but I was talking about risk-based program and enabling innovation and going beyond that. It also is about doing the right thing. We don't want to cause harm, not only to people and humans, but also to our own companies. Okay, and that was more of the general considerations around Gen AI. The next item is foundational considerations. I had mentioned that the fastest path to success is the ability to be able to go to the cloud and use Gen AI almost kind of like right away in out of the box fashion when you start leveraging services from all the major cloud service providers that are out there as well. So I've been talking about this ad nauseum now at this point, which is data defense becomes incredibly important. You have to know where your data is, where it's going, what it's going into, what it's coming out of. Is it accurate when it goes in? And is it accurate when it comes out of the LLM, just as an example? So you need to know provenance and lineage and data flow and have access to that data and assurance around that, that it's appropriate authorized access and you have an inventory of all your data and you need to classify your data so the LLM can understand it as well, whether you're using it as training for the LLM or you're using it as retrieval augmented generation for putting your data into the LLM so it can give you more relevant answers back as well. API security, can't talk about that enough. It's very important to make sure that you have that in place, that you have a full inventory of your APIs, that you're monitoring, you're detecting and responding, and that you have authentication token defense as well. If you haven't centralized your identity around Gen AI, you need to do that now. You need to shore up your identity proofing and account takeover prevention processes and shore up your verification. And it goes beyond human. We're talking machine identities as well, and including for all of this with a zero trust lens, meaning we trust but verify, meaning that we're going to do continuous authentication. We're going to check in session that if you should still be having access to this data. Those types of things that traditionally we hadn't done necessarily. We've always tried to strive towards these principles over the past decades or so. You need to have an inventory, your shadow IT that may be supporting your shadow AI. You need to know what your inventory is, and you need to have a good configuration management database. You also need to have good risk management. That means, and in the information security world, we're starting to call it more and more threat exposure management because of how quickly the threats change within an environment. It can be quite hard to get to the quantified analysis that we're used to, especially in enterprise, around enterprise risk management. But at the end of the day, we're protecting against catastrophic failure, which is the organization or company going out of business. That's a catastrophic event. Or it could be something else. You don't want to cause a fatality, physical harm, those types of things becomes very, very important as well. And then make sure you have good cloud hygiene because a lot of organizations are using cloud as their fastest path to success as well. All right, so only a couple more areas here, and then we'll start to wrap up, which is, okay, well, where do I focus, and where do I start from that perspective? So first things first, audit everything. That becomes very important. So make sure your policies are updated. It doesn't mean just doing a word change for some word to GenAI. There are some specific threats that you need to account for within your information security policies and standards. You should certainly perform a risk assessment and understand your security posture around GenAI as well. And if it's not measured, it's not managed. So you need to have your metrics, you need to have your KPIs, your KRIs. So therefore, logs will give you visibility. So audit logs, all audit logs, audit everything so you can have visibility. And therefore, that gives you transparency as well. And then, of course, I've been talking about guardrails this whole presentation as well, which is what should the LLM have access to? What's the data that it's using? What's the sensitivity of the data? Meaning, is it very confidential or restricted information? Or what's the criticality of the information? If that information is not accurate, is it going to cause the business to dysfunction or malfunction, I should say, as well, whether it's a process, people, or technology as well. Also, we've all seen the headlines where major corporations and organizations are suing OpenAI because they're saying, hey, to train your large language models. I mean, I love ChatGPT, but you've been using our licensed content to train your large language models. That's not fair. And if you're not going to make a deal with us, we're going to sue you. We're going to litigate you as well. Also, what intellectual property do you need to protect? What's your secret sauce? What is your core competency? And what is the data and information that absolutely cannot be exposed or leaked? We all can use a simple example of that. If we're going to do a major acquisition of a company, and these are two publicly traded companies, that information, because it'll greatly impact the stock market, cannot get out until the announcement of the letter of intent, as an example. And so very rarely do you see that leaked into the public. And there's a reason for that. It's because there's almost always very strong controls put around the information. You need to take the same considerations around the data that's going to be leveraged by Gen AI and large language models as well. And do you know all the data? Have you classified it all? Do you have an inventory of all the data? That becomes very important. And then what input and what output checking should I do? I need to make sure I am being ethical and that I'm not causing undue bias based on the use of Gen AI as well. So how do I implement the guardrails and what do I need to do to be able to ensure that based on the use case that I'm trying to do? We used a very simple example in this one to be able to do a simple threat model as well. And then with what do I retrain the LLM? This is very important. So what can happen is two things. One is uh, if you're thinking about using prompt input to train your LLM, meaning end users input to train your LLM, I would hold off on that for a very long time. And the reason is you need to have a baseline. You can still train the LLM, but not necessarily with prompts from end users. Is because you need to make sure that you're not introducing bias. What will happen is, and this makes a lot of sense, is that if the LLM is biased in in a way that is going to obstruct the business, meaning that's going to cause harm to the business because something is wrong with the LLM. If you keep retraining the LLM on the same data, it's going to make that bias sharper and sharper and sharper to the point where the LLM will become useless in terms of what you want it to do. Because again, it's based on the human brain. These are based on neural networks as well. And then, of course, we can't prevent everything 100% of the time. We have to be right 100% of the time as cybersecurity professionals and business operations defenders. And the attackers have to be right once. So we have to have detection and response. We have to make sure that we can detect. Do we know if we can detect something's wrong with the LLM? What do we know about that? We have new attack surface areas, which is retrieval augmented generation using vector databases. These are all considerations that you need to make sure that are in play as you start to do this, to do very good things with Gen AI, because there's a lot of, like I said, great use cases that are out there. We just have to make sure that we're doing it safely as well. And basically, the last piece that I'll say is, and then I can take a look at if there are questions that I can start answering, is don't wait. Start experimenting now. Even if you're a couple years away with your business, start using it. Even if it's a personal account, separate it completely from your work account, but start using Gen AI. Whether it's an assistant, a mobile app that you love, or maybe something you want to start using to be able to help summarize your meeting minutes, because that always takes up a lot of time, or summarize meeting notes, I should say. Start using it and start looking at what you can do to enable your business. This has been one of the best triggers with Gen AI being available for the consumer, for cybersecurity professionals, chief information security officers, chief security officers, to be able to really partner with their business and make good and great relationships to be able to enable them safely to use Gen AI. Because in some cases, it will, in the next 5 years, will transform some industries. There's no question about that. That's how powerful Gen AI is. So start now, start working with it. And if you're not sure where to start and wanted to start maybe seeing what some use cases are, we'd be more than happy to conduct a workshop with you, because it's possible to be able to do what we call rapid prototyping of use cases to find out what would be applicable to your environment as well. So if you want a workshop on Gen AI readiness, you certainly could engage us because we'd be more than happy to do that. And then also, if you're just not sure, there's also a quiz, readiness quiz that you can take as well that you see on this slide. All right, that's where I'll pause, and I'm going to see before we go into the advertisement for what's left, I wanted to see if there are any questions. I
Yeah,
see there is some Q&A.
yep. There's a few things we popped up the polls to work, so we can look at those quick. We did think this is going to share the poll. We asked two questions during the event. One about which Gen AI business value is essential to you. Um, so got a nice response. It looks like productivity and efficiency is definitely a top priority. And then the other one that we asked, which I think everybody agreed, have security concerns slow down your adoption? And there was an overwhelming response of yes there.
See, this is why I say it's so important to partner with your business. And I see this time and time again. I've been in IT, mainly IT security, information security, cybersecurity for, I can't believe it now, over 24 years or so. And it's a constant cycle. You see, just naturally through attrition and other various means, you see CISOs that'll cycle in and out of organizations, both enterprises, mid-market, you name the industry, whatever. And I hear time and time again that one of the key things is that we have to stop being the business unit and department of no. Yes, maybe we're saying no, but it's not no, it's we just want to build security in. And it really does come down to the approach, which is it's not no, you can't do this. It's how can we do this safely? And this is really a great opportunity because you can see still to this day in 2024, security is viewed as an inhibitor. And we can be an enabler. Yes, yes, part of my job is to keep you out of jail, and I'm serious when I say that. But having said that, it is also can be viewed as an enabler. And so it becomes very important that you look at how you're approaching it, which is, yes, we can do this. And the catalyst of Gen AI is a great opportunity to be shown as an enabler and get ahead of this. I know we get very busy in the work that we do from that perspective, but having a strategy around it is going to be important in terms of how you're going to approach it as well. So I'm sad to see that answer, but I also understand because we see it all the time as well.
Definitely. Do we have any other questions? And if you want to ask directly, happy to, unmute um, if needed. All right. With that, I think the final kind of closeout was just to talk about the fact that we are launching another Copilot uh, webinar, and that is on our studio product. It's a brand new product. Steve Daly is going to be hosting that event. And, Copilot Studio is a low code, no code platform to be able to launch these chatbots really quickly. So it kind of all ties very nicely together, and we can help with not only security, but then also helping with learning how to use this Copilot Studio product. So more info to come on that event. And with that, I want to thank everyone for attending and send a special thanks to Dan for covering all this great content. We're available to help in any way. And as Dan extended the offer, having a workshop and actually mapping out your chatbot and seeing where you might have issues could be very beneficial. I know from the marketing side, we've been trying to use this exact same approach. So thank you again, Dan, for all the great content, and everyone have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you. All right, take care.